expansion of its international faculty and students. Currently, Nazarbayev University occupies 106th place among the world's young universities and is #1 in Central Asia and Caucasus. NU is one of the co-founding members of the Asian Universities Alliance, which comprises 15 universities from 13 different countries, including such universities as Tsinghua University, University of Tokyo, Seoul National University, National University of Singapore, and many others. In a turbulent and rapidly changing world, the Central Eurasian Studies Society is playing an important role in bringing together scholars working on Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the wider Eurasian region. Researchers from different disciplines and countries share their work, exchange ideas, and build long-term collaborations. Indeed, interdisciplinarity is one of the key features of CSS conferences. This year's event brings together scholars from a wide range of disciplines, including anthropology, history, political science, sociology, education, linguistics, literature, public administration, cinematography, and others. We have more than 100 panels and 9 roundtables. Delegates from over 30 countries across Europe, the Americas, and Eurasia are attending this event. And if I'm not mistaken, more than 486 participants are registered for this conference this year. And again, this is not surprising, given CSS' unique role in bringing together established and early career scholars and strengthening scholarly networks across the field. Despite these achievements, there is still much work to be done. First, strengthening and expanding CSS institutional membership would further consolidate and develop the organization. We are fortunate to have outstanding scholars from leading universities around the world in our community, and each of us can contribute to broadening CSS reach. Second, it is important also to continue supporting the professional development of early career scholars, particularly from the region. While CSS already offers PhD workshops and training programs, there is further scope to promote research collaborations between established and emerging scholars. Today, Central Eurasia is attracting attention from scholars and policy makers alike. The region is experiencing significant political, economic, social, and technological changes. Questions of governance, development, identity, migration, security, environmental sustainability, climate change, and regional cooperation are becoming more important than ever. Understanding these processes requires rigorous research and thoughtful discussion. This regional conference provides exactly that opportunity. Dear participants of the CSS conference, over the next few days, we will hear new ideas, exchange views, and build professional relationships. I hope that all participants, and especially graduate students and early career scholars, will take advantage of these opportunities to engage with colleagues from different backgrounds and disciplines. And now I would like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors. This conference would not have been possible without their generous support. We are deeply grateful for their contributions. We would like to extend our sincere thanks to Data Lab, an initiative of the Yale Foundation, Cynthia Werner, Professor of Anthropology at Texas A&M University, Allison Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Washington, Department of History at the Ohio State University, Harriman Institute at Columbia University, American University of Central Asia Foundation, Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Thank you for your support, dedication, and assistance. I would also like to thank our institutional members, including Central Asia Initiative at Yale University, Harriman Institute at Columbia University, Russian, Eurasian, and East European Research Group at Northwestern University, Akbulat Education Group, Yale Umete Corporate Fund, and Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Thank you for your commitment to CSS, which helps ensure that our community remain strong, connected, and intellectually vibrant. We are grateful for your investment in the future of Central Eurasian Studies. And of course, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the many staff members, faculty, and student volunteers who worked hard to make this event possible. Particularly, special thanks goes to the Graduate School of Public Policy. Because Graduate School of Public Policy actually is the main organizer of this conference. And special thanks I would like to express to Amina Ahmedbekova, the GSPP Research Manager. Amina, where are you? Okay, she's not here. Okay, Amina. She was probably the one person who was responsible for all these, administrative things and organizing the conference. Thank you so much. Amina, research manager at the Graduate School of Public Policy. I also would like to thank Saltanat Abdenova, our social media person, who also was active in organizing the conference. I would like to thank, of course, Arsen Musabekova, Chief Executive Officer, for helping with this. That's it. The Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy. I would like also to thank people from the CSS organization, Karla Claude Svensson. Ryan Hart is the media person, the media communication person, manager. Thank you so much. Great job. I'm really impressed. Thank you. Also would like to thank Timur Dadabaev, who is the treasurer of CSS, and our faculty, Nazarbayev University faculty, Helen Thibault and Snezhana Atanova. Thank you very much. Also, of course, there was a lot of work done by the conference committee at Nazarbayev University and CSS conference committee. Thank you for your hard work and dedication, for your efforts, help, and enthusiasm. Finally, I would like to welcome all our guests to Kazakhstan. We hope you enjoy your stay in Astana and have an opportunity to experience the hospitality, culture, and energy of our city. Thank you for being here, and I wish you a productive conference, engaging discussions, and many new connections. Once again, welcome to the 2026 CSS Regional Conference at Nazarbayev University. And, those of you who don't know me, I'm Dina Sharipova, the CSS president. I'm working at the Graduate School of Public Policy as associate professor. Thank you so much. And Vice Dean for Research, yes. And now I would like to invite to the stage the Vice President and Professor Gulmira Kanay to welcome the participants and delegates of the CSS conference. Gulmira, you're welcome.
Distinguished scholars, esteemed guests, representatives of the Central Eurasian Studies Society, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the leadership of Nazarbayev University, unfortunately, Professor Ahmad could not join us this morning. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to Astana, to our campus for Central Eurasian Studies Society Regional Conference 2026. We are delighted to host this important international gathering, which brings together leading scholars, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners from across the world to engage in a meaningful dialogue on the theme Rethinking Central Eurasia's Spaces, Societies, and Power. This conference represents far more than a series of academic sessions. It is a platform for intellectual exchange, interdisciplinary collaboration, and the advancement of knowledge about one of the world's most dynamic and strategically significant regions. Through research presentations, panel discussions, and scholarly networking, participants will contribute to a deep understanding of Central Eurasia's past, present, and future. We are particularly honored that the Central Eurasian Studies Society has chosen Nazarbayev University as its partner, as a host institution for its 2026 regional conference. Since its establishment, CESS has played a vital role in fostering international scholarship, promoting academic excellence, and building a vibrant community of researchers dedicated to the study of Central Eurasia. Its mission of facilitating scholarly dialogue and promoting cooperation among researchers and resonate strongly with the values and aspirations of our university. As Kazakhstan's flagship research university, Nazarbayev University was founded with an ambition of becoming a bridge between East and West, connecting global knowledge with regional priorities. Today, we are proud to serve as a platform where scholars from diverse disciplines and countries come together to address complex societal challenges, generate new ideas, and advance impactful research. I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the organizing committee, the leadership of the Central Eurasian Studies Society, and the NU Graduate School of Public Policy, our faculty and staff, and many volunteers whose dedication and hard work have made this event possible. May this conference inspire new ideas, strengthen academic networks, and contribute to the advancement of scholarships for years to come. Once again, welcome to Nazarbayev University, welcome to Astana, and welcome to the CESS Regional Conference 2026. I wish you a productive and engaging and memorable conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gulmira. And now I would like to invite the Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy to welcome our delegates, Professor Rector.
The main problem of being the third speaker after two very good and informative speeches is many of the points you want to make have already been made. So you find yourself in a bit of a pickle because you don't know what else to add. On a more serious note, when university was created in 2010, we were created to perform three basic functions. The first was to be the first and finally world-class research university in Kazakhstan. Previous efforts have been made. You go across the street, you find Eurasian University. Eurasian University did receive some support, but never became what we've become. On the other hand, we were established, we had a lot of political support, a lot of resources. We were able to recruit a good leadership team, great faculty members, and we a true force to be reckoned with. So, you know, Dina alluded to it, we're in the rankings, doing well, but in these 15 years, we published 12,115 papers indexed in Scopus, not to mention all these additional publications we published, including books, monographs that are not actually indexed in Scopus. So we are in the top 23% in the world. We are number 4 among Turkic universities, and we are obviously the number 1 university in the country and in the Caucasus and Central Asia. So we did establish ourselves as a top-notch university regionally, globally, and given the ambitions of our new leadership team, we plan to get even much better in the years to come. So we hope to be able in a few years to crack in the top 300, top 200, and produce more research and be more relevant locally, as Gulmira already mentioned. The second thing that we were supposed to do was we were not do some research like some of the famous international universities in Kazakhstan. And in many ways, we did transform Kazakhstan, or we did contribute to the transformation and the change in Kazakhstan. Our School of Medicine was very instrumental in the modernization of the healthcare provision in the country. The School of Education trains deans, vice rectors, and several of the graduates of the Graduate School of Education go on to pursue and or have posts or positions in leadership as rectors. You know, in my school, some of our students end up being vice ministers a couple of weeks after graduation. Obviously, you all understand that's because of me. No, it's not true. But you get the point. So we train middle-level civil servants. We also train political leaders. You know, we had 2 vice ministers in 3 years. We have Akims, we have local governors. So we do have an impact on the political class and the leadership in the country. But we contributed more in that. If you go back to the history of GSPP, the last GSPP started, the university started in 2010, we started in 2012. And in the 14 years history, 13 and a half of GSPP, we've been always involved in policy reforms and constitutional reforms in the country. When the anti-corruption legislation was being revised by the Office of the General Prosecutor, GSPP faculty provided expert opinion and advice on how that law should be revised or modified or improved. When in 2016, the country was debating the provision that eventually became the 100 concrete steps, those were discussed in the room 1010 right here. Kojanjarov, that at the time was the chairperson of the Agency for Civil Service and Anti-Corruption, used to come here on a weekly basis, every week on a Friday with his team to discuss with us what we can do to adopt, for example, code of ethics, code of conduct, what can we do to actually improve the ethical standards of civil servants. That was discussed here. Some of my colleagues were actually asked to write some of the provisions that eventually entered in the 100 concrete steps. That's how deep our involvement was. In 2016, there were constitutional reforms. And again, several of us, several colleagues in GSPP, were asked to contribute ideas, opinions, insight, input on how the Constitution should be revised. And even though that didn't happen in 2017, but it happened after the January event, when President Tokayev decided to constitutionalize political opposition parties here in Kazakhstan, that idea was flagged by some faculty member of GSPP already in 2017. In 2019, this year, we had the constitutional reforms. Many of us in GSPP were actively involved in actually sharing opinion, participating in public discourse, either to provide input on how the Constitution should be modified, or actually explaining what could be the advantage of some of the proposed reforms. So we've been very, very active. And I think that by doing research on Kazakhstan, by training political officials, but by providing advice to the government, we have actually played a role in contributing to the transformation of Kazakhstan. That's something we should be extremely, extremely proud of. A final point, Gulmira made it already, the third function that we're supposed to play was that of a bridge. Well, several years ago, you know, in the early 90s, 1992, Umberto Eco published a book called The Limits of Interpretation, and he said that every limen is a finis, which translated from Latin means that every border is a limit. And so, you know, to go beyond this limit and these borders and to go across bridges in the ancient times, in ancient Rome, but in other parts of the world, including Africa, to cross those bridges, you had to perform a ritual because it was sacrilege to go across a border or a natural separation like a river. And so, you know, the Romans, they created this institution that still exists now in a Catholic version, which is the Pontifex. Actually, that's the role that we play. We are not a bridge, we are building bridges. And I think that this conference gives us the opportunity to actually bridge what the scholarship that we produce here in Astana, here at Nazarbayev University, here in Kazakhstan, with the scholarship that is being conducted on Central Eurasian around the world. And I think this will give us an opportunity to remain in contact and to do more and better research together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo, for your very inspiring speech. And I think that it would not be right if I also do not introduce our forthcoming president of CESS organization in 2027, Alexander Kulik, who also visited Astana and this conference today. Alexander, please. All right, and so this is now a very important time for our speaker. I would like to introduce Dr. Timur Dadabaev, who is a professor of international relations and the director of the special program for Japanese and Eurasian studies at the University of Tsukuba, Japan, and Swedish Research Council guest professor at the Lund University. He's also professor of international relations and the vice rector for research and innovation at the University of World Economy and Diplomacy under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan. Professor Dadabaev published extensively with numerous very reputable journals, including International Affairs, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, the Pacific Review, Europe-Asia Studies, Nationalities Papers, Journal of Contemporary China, Asian Survey, Asia-Europe Journal, and many, many others. His most recent books are Strategic Silences and Narrative Power in International Relations. ambiguity and non-verbal diplomacy in reframing Central Asian agency, co-authored with Sonoda Shigeto and published in June 2026 with Routledge, and Bridges Across Borders, Dynamics of Central Eurasian Migration to Australia, Japan, and Northern Europe, also co-authored with Shigeto Sonoda and Kirill Nozhanov, published in April 2026. In fact, there is a very long list of publications because Professor Dadabaev is a very prolific scholar. We know this, right? That's why he's a distinguished guest speaker today at our conference. And I would like also just to say a few things that just before the start of this conference, we were discussing that over many, many years, the keynote speakers at the CESS conference were always female scholars. And we had a little bit of gender discrimination. Only 2 speakers, I think, that were males, and we didn't have any male keynote speaker recently, and particularly from the region. So, Professor Dadabaev, the floor is yours. You're very welcome.
So first of all, Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I would like, first of all, to take the opportunity to thank Nazarbayev University, CESS board for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of you. We are very much proud of the achievements of Nazarbayev University, but also the CESS as perhaps one of the only platforms where we in Central Eurasian Studies have an opportunity to discuss ideas and perhaps challenge the notions which some of us or many of us take for granted. Now, before I start my talk today, I would like to make a few points. The first one is was kindly introduced by Professor Sharipova. I am privileged to serve in several leadership positions, as exemplified by the directorship at the University of Tsukuba, but also being served as concurrently serving as Vice Rector for Research and Innovation at the University of World Economy and Diplomacy under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Uzbekistan. However, what I'm going to talk today is something that I'm going to speak on my own behalf as a scholar of international relations, and I would like to emphasize this point so that my statements are not considered to be a reflection on the stakeholders that I represent. The second point that I would like to emphasize before I start my own sort of talk today is in regards to the conventional keynotes that we are used to hear. Looking at the room, I actually see many esteemed colleagues who construct the field of Central Eurasian Studies. So for me, to summarize your own research and to tell you what you already know would not really make much sense and would not be fair to you and to your time. So if you allow me, I would like to address perhaps one of the puzzles that I've observed in the recent literature on Central Eurasia, and perhaps, together think about the answers to the questions that I'm going to raise in a few minutes. Now, my talk today is titled Quiet Power, Strategic Silence, Decolonial Diplomacy, and Transformative Resilience in Central Asia. And this is a bit too broad. So in terms of the puzzle that led me to think about this topic, I've noticed reading the literature on Central Eurasia that the senior generation of scholars, very often, and this is especially true, for 1990s, and I intentionally do not cite people so that, I'm not going to the point to them, but, for decades, Central Asia has been portrayed as corridor, buffer, periphery, the object of great power rivalry. And we are very much lucky that, the next generation of scholarship now emerged, which increasingly talks about the agency, the decolonial perspectives. We increasingly talk about local voices and perceptions. We also talk about the ways, the alternative ways of knowing the region. And I think this is very important scholarship. And again, I mean, I'm a bit hesitant to name a few scholars, but these are the the works which are championed by Dina, by Erika Marat, by Botagoz Kosimbayeva, and many others. So I think managed to achieve some advances in placing Central Asia onto the epistemological sort of map of Central Eurasian studies. However, in recent scholarship, there are some other scholars who actually, suggest that we need to go a bit deeper. It's not just enough to talk about a local agency. It's not only enough to talk about approaches to, Central Eurasia from a local perspective, but perhaps we need to think about what is the eventual impact of that literature, or what is the outcome. And on my slide, I have this work or the citation from great work by Ed Schatz, recently intervention, where he suggests that the colonial approaches to Central Asia tend to make claims in an epistemological register, but such work typically avoids ontological claims about what decolonization as an outcome would look like in the region itself. So essentially, what it means that the work that we produce so far tell us about how knowledge is produced, how voices are, what voices are privileged, and how particular narratives became dominant. But they often stop short of making ontological claims about what is it that this kind of agency produces. What is the outcome of this process? And how can we trace that agency? And I think, these are, we had this discussion, with several colleagues on this particular approach, on this critique of decolonial studies. And we have, diverging views on this. Some colleagues believe that, that approaches define the outcome, which is true. But nevertheless, this particular issue of what is it that we produce and how this agency actually looks like at the end of the day is a fair question. And I think, this is something that I would like to address today in my talk, although briefly. So this leads me to this main question of my presentation today. So if Central Asia possesses agency, what kind of regional order is that agency producing? I think, this is a very important question, especially in the contemporary world, where it would perhaps not be exaggeration to say that we are living in the neo-imperial world where invasions, the land grabbing or domination of the narratives became a very sort of normal, things of affairs. So in order to answer this question, my argument is the following. So Central Asian region produces sovereign regionalism. Now, this is a, sovereign regionalism which is composed of the fourfold sort of points. The first one is that it features what I refer to as relational nationhood. The second point is that this relational nationhood is possible because out of the toolkit that we have, there is this notion of strategic silence that is employed in Central Asian context. And that is complemented by what I call quiet regionalism, the informal and non-declarative coordination, which actually creates an order of a kind within this region. And the final sort of element of this structure is what I call patchwork neighborhoods, the multiple and sometimes overlapping neighborhood ties that sustain coexistence without requiring deep integration. So let me, in the remaining part of my talk, let me just explain each of these points. So what we observe in the region is that the very notion of sovereign regionalism seems a bit counterintuitive. On the one hand, we talk about, sovereignty and importance of individual states and their, performance. On the other hand, we also see that regionalism is taking, very sort of active pace in the region. So we see cooperation intensified, we see dialogue expanded. We also see the connectivity, which has increased over these years. At the same time, the sovereignty remains robust. We continue to emphasize the issues of sovereignty. So, indeed, one may even argue that the regional cooperation that we have in Central Asia has strengthened rather than weakened state sovereign nationhood. To explain this phenomena, I propose the four interconnected mechanisms as I just mentioned. So the sovereign regionalism in that particular sense refers to the sovereignty as preserved rather than pooled. The cooperation which is pursued without deep integration. Ambiguity is managed rather than eliminated. And again, I mean, we as students of the Western political thought and Western theories of international relations actually find all of these propositions to be a bit contradictory, because we are trained to think that sovereignty is something which distinguishes one state from another. The cooperation is a tool which pools resources into something holistic. Ambiguity is a negative notion, according to the Western political science, where when you're too sort of obscure or not very concrete, that is a weakness. And regional stability, as we see it here, emerges through the relational coexistence rather than hierarchy. Again, I mean, this is a bit counterintuitive, because we are trained to think of integration, at least the major theories of integration point to the issue that that integration needs to be institutionalized. It needs to be it needs to have some kind of structure which is fixed, and that provides for its strength. However, what we see in Central Asia is not this kind of features, and so that sort of brings this question of whether something is wrong with the region or maybe something is wrong with the benchmark. Now, talking about the benchmark, the European Union became explicitly or implicitly the benchmark against which the regional projects are evaluated. Well, whether we like it or not, the European Union is this voice in our head whenever we think of the integration. So from this perspective, Central Asia often appears weak. Institutions seem undeveloped. Regional organizations appear fragile. Integration itself seems limited, but again, perhaps the problem lies in the benchmark. What if preserving sovereignty is not a failure of regionalism, but one of its objectives? What if ambiguity is not a problem to be solved, but a political resource to be managed? From this perspective, then Central Asia begins to look very different. Regionalism here is not designed to transcend sovereignty or nationhood. It is designed to sustain nationhood and reformulate sovereignty. And this distinction leads us directly to the first mechanism that I talked about, and that is the relational nationhood. So states are often depicted as autonomous in theoretical discussions, independent, and they are there to distinguish themselves from the others. And if you look through major international relation theories, you see these depictions. Yet Central Asian political practice suggests something rather different. To be a nation in Central Asia is also to be a neighbor. Indeed, one can argue that national identity and regional relationships are mutually constitutive. To put it in different words, neighborhood defines your nationhood and not the other way around. So in order for the state to be a strong state, one needs to have a stable neighborhood. And successful national project depends upon regional coexistence. Nationhood, therefore, becomes relational. This observation becomes particularly visible when we examine the cultural and normative vocabulary through which regional relationships are understood. Take example of maslahat. And again, I'm using this term because I'm coming from Uzbek background, but I'm pretty sure that within Central Asian context, we have similar vocabulary in majority of languages. So this notion of maslahat emphasizes the consultation before the action, the search for consensus, the avoidance of unnecessary confrontation. Or take the example of sabr, which is an ethnic but also religious norm of endurance or restraint. And we have many examples where there would be some tensions or even conflicts where endurance is in place, where states do not rush into confrontation, where states do not rush to open these conflicts. Or finally the ideas of brotherhood. Again, I mean, when I've given a few talks on brotherhood, and some people take it as a sentimental argument. And again, I mean, I'm not against the use of the emotions in international relations. I think it actually opens a new sort of kind of research for us. However, in this particular context, this brotherhood not necessarily is a sentimental sense, but as a language of mutual obligation and attachment. Taken together, these concepts reveal an understanding of politics that differs from purely Westphalian assumptions that we are accustomed to. So political order emerges not only through boundaries, but also through relationships. Sovereignty itself becomes relational. So the notion that is given to us, inherited by us, and reproduced by us from the Westphalian system in Central Asia is being reconsidered and reconstructed. And we are in this process of reconstruction. So this does not mean that states cease to be sovereign. Rather, sovereignty is exercised through a regional environment that helps sustain it. And once we begin to view nationhood as relational, another question naturally emerges. If regional coexistence is so important, how do states manage disagreements without undermining relationship upon which this order depends? So if each of us are so different, what is the way we communicate? How is it that we construct something together when there is this notion of sovereignty, which is so different from one state to another? And that takes me to my second point about the notion of the strategic silence as narrative now. Now, I should begin by acknowledging that this concept initially emerged from a very simple observation. When we study international relations, we tend to focus on what states say. We study declarations, speeches, alliances, treaties, military interventions. Take Trumpism for that case, So we focus so much on what he says and what that means. In other words, we study visible politics. The discipline itself has developed a certain bias toward articulation. Agency becomes associated with visibility. To be an actor means to speak, to announce, and then to align and demonstrate yourself. But when you think of Central Asia, are these the features of agency that we have? Not necessarily. In Central Asia, speaking is as much important as not speaking. So that's the point that that I'm trying to make about the strategic science. In many respects, these assumptions run through the both realist and liberalist positions. Power is often measured by the ability to shape agendas publicly. Influence is associated with the visible actions. Diplomatic success is often equated with public positioning. Yet, as I examined Central Asian diplomacy over the years, I became increasingly convinced that something important was being overlooked and missing. Some of the most consequential political actions were not necessarily public. They were not necessarily articulated. They were not always announced. In many cases, they were deliberately left ambitious and ambiguous. This raises a provocative question. What if silence is not simply the absence of communication? What if silence is itself a form of communication? What if silence or ambiguity that it brings is not evidence of weakness, but evidence of strategic calculation? And what if restraint is not passivity, but a source of political agency? These questions matter because they challenge one of the deepest assumptions within the international relations as a field. These questions matter because they challenge, the assumption that what counts is an action, what counts is a power. And they force us to reconsider how agency is actually exercised in the context characterized by asymmetry of geopolitical uncertainty. And let's face it, Central Asia is in the context of asymmetry and geopolitical uncertainty. So for Central Asian states, silence is really empty. More often it is purposeful, it's productive, strategic, and most importantly, it is relational. It is constructed in communications with others. States remain silent not because they have nothing to say. They remain silent because the objective is not a concealment, it's maneuverability, preserving the options, and sustaining relationships. And in the region where coexistence remains critically important, these objectives matter enormously. So traditional international relations scholarship often assumes that agency requires visibility, its ability to speak, its ability to align publicly, its ability to make commitments. The underlying assumption here is very clear. Visibility context, even necessarily mean because positions taken without actually, but perhaps in the Western, more rational setting, different story. So how, this is very sort of challenging in the international relations, but if we look outside of the international relations, we find a very different intellectual tradition. We see certain scholars which remind us that the voice is not the only response. Certain silence also matters. Even suggests that than direct confrontation. Across sociology and anthropology, scholars have repeatedly and for a very long time emphasized that silence can be active rather than passive. So silence can communicate, silence can resist, silence can argue that Central Asia offers an excellent example of this broader insight. Silence in this context is not simply avoidance, it's a political technology. It allows governments to defer confrontation without abandoning the principle. It allows them to communicate disagreements without provoking escalation. It allows them to preserve relationships while maintaining autonomy. And most importantly, silence often creates room for future adjustments. Public declarations once made are very difficult to retract. Careful calibration and ambiguity allows flexibility. And this particular valuable for states operating in a very complex geopolitical environment. And Central Asia is one of these examples where it has to do with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and many others, which are very complex actors. And so when you are placed in this complex environment, the technology of communication needs also to be a bit more nuanced when we what we are used to in the Western tradition. So in this particular sense, it is important to suggest that, and I'm currently sort of pitching this framework of silence, that the silence itself is not a singular sort of phenomenon. There are many silences. The first form of silence I call hedging silence. This occurs when states deliberately avoid definitive commitments in order to preserve flexibility. The second type of form of silence is cooperative silence. In this case, actors deliberately avoid emphasizing disagreements because doing so would undermine cooperation in other fields. The third form of silence is symbolic silence. Sometimes what is not said sends a message more powerful than any public statement. The fourth form of silence is relational silence. This is particularly important for Central Asia. Relationships are preserved through selective restraint. Not every disagreement is publicly articulated, and not every grievance is elevated into a political dispute. And finally, the fifth point of type of silence is something that I call resistant silence. Again, if you guys have questions, I would be very much happy to discuss this, but again, this framework of silence is in work in progress. So this is why I describe silence as a narrative power, because it empowers different nations, smaller nations in approaching different other states. Now, the best example to show how strategic silence works is the example of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, the states would eventually, the idea with the international nations is that, when you have the aggressor, like exemplified by Russia, states would need to be taking sides. Some would align openly with Russia, others would distance themselves. So a binary framework dominated much of the discussion, yet this is not what happened in Central Asia. Instead, we observed something much more interesting and nuanced. Most Central Asian governments adopted positions characterized by careful ambiguity. Majority of these countries avoided explicit bloc alignment. Most of them refrained from recognizing territorial annexations. At the same time, most also avoided direct anti-Russian confrontation. So to many external observers, this appeared inconsistent. And some would even argue this is the weakness of Central Asia, or the navigating a profound asymmetry of environment. Russia remained an important security actor, an important economic actor, migration destination, and historical point of reference. At the same time, countries like Ukraine or the Western alliances, they remain very closely associated with the national and regional interests of the states. So silence became a resource. A strategic ambiguity in this particular sense became a solution of the positioning problem. So what we witnessed at the end of the day is not indecision. It was not, it was a calibration, not passivity, but kind of strategy that the states used. Not absence of agency, but agency expressed differently. And this is where I find Kuyk's work on hedging particularly useful. According to him, smaller states operating in asymmetric environments often seek to avoid binary choices. Yet I would suggest that Central Asian case goes a bit further than hedging. What we observed is not simply risk management, it is also sovereignty management. Silence becomes a way of protecting political autonomy, a way of preserving diplomatic flexibility, a way to avoid entrapment. So for this reason, I have sometimes described these practices as forms of sovereign intelligence, the ability to navigate uncertainty without surrender. So it was important to retain the ability to maintain relationships without abandoning interest. And let's face it, geography suggests that Russia, China, or Iran are not going to disappear, despite this conflict or despite these disagreements with the West. So the silences alone, but I also agree that silence alone cannot produce regional order. So the next question that leads me to the next point is, how does cooperation actually occur if there is this strategic silence? If actors mean certain things, but they are not very straightforward and they are not very open about it. And so that leads me to the point about something that I call quiet regionalism. If strategic silence helps explain how states manage disagreements, quiet regionalism helps explain how they cooperate despite those disagreements. For many years, the dominant interpretation was relatively very straightforward. Regionalism in Central Asia was often portrayed as weak, fragmented, and underdeveloped. Observers pointed to limited institutionalization. Actually, I still see a number of studies which suggest that because there is no sufficient institutionalization, the region is weak. They also pointed to the preference of bilateral relationships and also presence of bilateral disputes. And they frequently concluded that regionalism has failed in this region. Yet this interpretation always struck me as somewhat unsatisfactory. Because while analysts were focusing on what was absent, something else was happening simultaneously. Regional cooperation was expanding. The transportation networks were becoming more interconnected. Water agreements were concluded. Water issues have been resolved or at least negotiated. Energy cooperation continued. Technical experts met regularly. And government officials communicated continuously throughout these years. So, in other words, regionalism was occurring. It simply did not look like models of regionalism that many scholars expected to find, or the blueprints that we are accustomed to. And again, that brings this question of benchmark. This is why I use the term quiet regionalism. The adjective quiet is important here. Quiet does not mean weak. Quiet does not mean insignificant. Quiet does not mean passive. Quiet refers to the style of cooperation. And again, here, there are 2 points from this slide that I would like to emphasize. First, region is increasingly being accepted as C5 region. And over the last year alone, we had 7 summits, the C5 plus Russia, C5 plus China, C5 plus Italy, C5 plus Europe, C5 plus Korea, C5 plus Japan. So that alone sends a message that region is increasingly and C5 plus the United States, right? I mean the first time. So, but there is another point. C5 is quietly transforming into C6. We increasingly see Azerbaijan as being part of this region, as being part of this grouping, and as connecting closer to the activities that we see in the city. So in that particular sense, a regional differentiation is existent, but it's without othering. Where in this region, when we talk about C5, it's not pushing away the other actors. It's kind of inclusivity that we emphasize throughout this regionalism construction. So we observe regionalism operating through different mechanisms that those emphasized by classical integration theories. And once we recognize this, many developments and that previously appeared puzzling suddenly become easier to understand. Now, in terms of the debate on regionalism, I intentionally do not cite scholars so that I do not unintentionally sort of offend them. But in terms of groups, we can imagine that there is a formalist view which says there is an important role of institutions to be played. And once they're placed, then regionalism is considered to be strong. And if we do not have institutions, then we have weak institutions, weak foundations for regionalism, insufficient integration, and as a consequence, regional weakness. Then we have a romantic view, that I call idealist, who emphasize the importance of informality. They suggest that informality allows for flexible coordination, constructive ambiguity, informal cooperation as the backbone of regionalism, and regional adaptation. Well, I think both sides have very valuable points to make, but I don't feel that these two sides actually tell the full story. My argument in the whole thing is that there is a notion of selective institutionalization. So when needed, there are certain areas where the institutions are created. When the maturity is not achieved yet, these are left to informality. There is also something that I call managed ambiguity. To some extent, many issues are left untouched because there is this perception that there is a premature institutionalization which can actually hurt the prospects of creating the structures. And that then sort of arrives at the point of sovereign regionalism, where sovereignty is not questioned. It is used as a tool to forward the notion of regionalism. So the key claim here is that Central Asia is neither under-integrated nor post-institutional. It's governed through the selective institutionalism, tacit coordination, and strategic silence as the notions. Now, the best example for this would be water wars. Now, over the years, over the last 30 years, we've been discussing conference after conference, or paper after the paper, that water resources were unevenly distributed, national interests diverged, demand was increasing, and climate pressures were intensifying. So the imagery was created that the water wars are inevitable. Now, that does not mean that we did not have conflicts in the region over the water. However, what is important and what is remarkable is how those disputes were managed. I was quite surprised when the clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan happened. The media coverage almost celebrated these clashes because finally, the conflict happened, and finally the predictions actually worked. But what actually strikes me in this case is that the way the conflict was managed, the way this regional sort of encouragement not to expand the conflict, and the way it supported this conflict resolution, it was much more important than the celebration of conflict itself. So the point that I would like to make here is that over the years, regarding water, engineers continued talking, experts continued meeting, governments continued negotiating, and were revised, compromises were explored. Problems were postponed when solutions proved difficult. This is precisely what quiet regionalism looks like in practice. It's very dramatic, and we know in Western media or even political science, we like dramatic stuff. And it rarely generates headlines, it rarely attracts international attention, yet over the time it produces outcomes that are politically significant. When we focus only on spectacular events, we miss the everyday practices that actually sustain regional order. And in many respects, the absence of water wars may be more analytically revealing than the presence of the conflict itself. And it demonstrates that sovereign regionalism is not merely a theoretical proposition, it is an observable practice. And the final sort of chain in this structure is what I call patchwork neighborhoods. Now, there is this proposition that maybe, we are moving towards middle power realignment. In Central Asian case, not exactly. A region is imagined as a coherent geographic space. Actors either belong or do not belong to it according to the conventional theories of international relations. Relationships are expected to be relatively stable, but Central Asia does not fit this imagery particularly well. The region simultaneously participates in multiple political, economic, cultural, and strategic spaces. Russia remains important, China remains important, Turkey remains important, South Korea and Japan are increasingly important. Gulf states have become very important. Europe matters, South Asia matters, and Southeast Asia even matters more. So these relationships do not replace one another. This is not about exclusivity. It's not about the choice of choosing one partner against the other. They overlap, they coexist, they interact. The result is not a single neighborhood. It is precisely this multiplicity that generates flexibility in Central Asian context. This does not eliminate constraints, of course, but it does expand opportunities, and perhaps more importantly, it strengthens the authority or autonomy of Central Asian states. So when we imagine Central Asian patchwork neighborhood, this is the image that I have in my mind. Connections spread in multiple directions simultaneously. Different partnerships serve different purposes. Economic cooperation may involve in one set of actors. Security cooperation may involve in another. Educational exchanges may involve in completely different one. And the objective is not to choose one, but the objective is to participate in as many as possible in order to enhance one's capacity to implement domestic and foreign policies. So why I call this patchwork? The hierarchy, which is the direct opposite of the patchwork, is the hierarchy implies a center. Patchwork implies multiple centers. Hierarchy imposes a structure. Patchworks permit flexibility. For smaller and medium-sized states, this flexibility is particularly valuable and important. It allows them to avoid excessive dependence. It allows them to maintain room for the maneuver. And most importantly, it allows them to preserve sovereignty while expanding connectivity. This observation, again, brings us back to the broader puzzle that I sort of envisaged in the beginning. If Central Asia possesses agency, what kind of order is that agency producing? And so I'm almost at the end of my presentation. So let me conclude. So, at the beginning of this presentation, we talked about, the agency and what kind of outcome we're looking at. And I fully agree with the notions that, the agency is important. But we also need to think about, what this agency actually is producing. And whether we like it or not, we do not actually have too many examples yet, which are empirically proven that we can actually claim that, this is the Central Asian agency which produces it. And quiet order or sovereign regionalism that I talked to is one example that I thought would be useful. And again, we can have many others if you guys, pitch in. So I have called this order sovereign regionalism. It's a foundations which do not emphasize supranational institutions. Its foundationals are relational. They are practical. They are adaptive. They are deeply rooted in the political realities of region. And I have argued that sovereign regionalism operates through 4 interconnected mechanisms, and that is relational nationhood, strategic silence as a communicative tool, quiet regionalism, and patchwork neighborhood. Taken together, these mechanisms reveal a region that is neither passive nor peripheral, a region that is neither merely responding to external powers, nor simply reproducing inherited structures. Rather, they reveal a region actively produced in its own forms of order. So this order does not seek to transcend sovereignty, it seeks to sustain it. And sovereignty here needs to be reconsidered, and this does not need to be taken, in line with the traditional sort of definitions of sovereignty. It does not eliminate ambiguity, it manages ambiguity. It does not pursue integration for its own sake. It pursues cooperation on terms that remain compatible with autonomy. And perhaps the most important lesson that I would like to leave with you today, Central Asia should not be understood merely as a recipient of global orders, and nor merely as an arena in which large powers compete. It should increasingly be understood as a producer of regional order in its own right. An order built not on hierarchy but coexistence, not on uniformity but flexibility, not on certainty but on the productive management of ambiguity. Strategic silence helps sustain this order. Quiet regionalism helps operationalize it. Patchwork neighborhoods help expand it. And together they constitute what I have called sovereign regionalism. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward for your comments, questions, and critiques. Thank you.
And our assistants will help you with cities and
You were talking of quiet power. Isn't it something like non-alignment movement which was started almost 70 years back by some of the countries of Asia and Africa? The only difference is that in the non-alignment movement, the countries which were participating in that movement, they were not neighboring each other. And now in the quiet power, the concept which you have given, they all are the neighboring powers. And we have seen the climax of, anti-climax of NAB also. Isn't it something like that?
Shall we perhaps collect a few questions?
Yes, we can take one more question, please.
Professor Solomon University. Interesting your idea about patchwork. Every time I think about, I'm a data science specialist, but I'm all physics. Gravity forces, gravity forces is everywhere in our universe, everywhere. In case of your patchwork, what do you think about gravity forces which exist in this Central Asia?
Gravity forces.
Yes.
One more turn. One more question, maybe? Yes, please.
Charlie Buxton, Books for Development. In the context of what many people call New Cold War or Third World War, and the pressure from the main actors in that war to bring people, different countries or regimes onto their side, and their tendency to give privileges to those countries that are prepared politically or economically to support their position. Would the attempt to be neutral or non-aligned or regional and sovereign, though that has obviously many attractions, isn't there a risk that you miss out on all the opportunities for alliance with the people who have the big capital and the military power and the influence in the United Nations and so on? Isn't it really basically also avoiding some of the big questions which are raised today about economic inequality, political inequality, and just staying out of the big argument which rages in many countries of the world due to the war movement of the governments and the anti-war movement of many other actors. People from Central Asia go into different countries for study and work. They observe these debates. Is it really possible they will just come back and forget what is going on in the rest of the world?
Question, yeah, I'll go with three and then.
У меня такой вопрос. Какие пасторы?
Три вопроса, потом будет. Хорошо?
So thank you very much. So the first question about non-alignment, isn't it the same, but in regional sort of context? Now, the context of non-alignment movement is very different from the context that we are facing currently in Central Asia. Non-alignment movement was a response to the ideological struggle between different camps. And so this was an attempt by developing countries not to be played by both camps in this ideological struggle. Now, what we see, and the alignment movement, the way I see it, is more a reactionary process. So this is the reaction that developing countries produced as a response to the attempts by the United States on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other to sort of get them involved in the struggle. Now, in Central Asia, we see something which is partly reactive, but more proactive. Essentially, what we see is an attempt to design a policy which would not signal their refrain or restraint from participating in certain actions, but rather tool, as I exemplified through the strategic science, of sending a message about what is it that they stand for and what is it that their national interest or culture code aligns with. And I think this proactive side is a bit different from what you described, because in the case of non-alignment movement, essentially there were two choices that these states had to choose or to refrain. Here, in Central Asia, we have multiple choices, and these choices are not as straightforward, and they're not in black and white coloring. And I think the quiet regionalism that I'm here emphasizing is, in that particular sense, is more nuanced, more sort of calibrated, and more sort of designed to respond to the needs of multiple actors. So you cannot really say, we're not aligning with Russia, we're aligning with Russia. In the same way, it would be difficult to say, in a very straightforward matter, what areas, the Central Asia aligns with China or other players. There is so much nuances that needs to be calibrated, and in that particular sense, this complexity is much more difficult when it comes to the non-alignment movement. Now, in terms of the gravity force, I'm sorry, not in physics, not that I've been good in physics, to say the least, but the way the gravity force, the way I take it is the notion of anchoring. What is the anchoring element, or what is the most sort of pulling element, within the structure? Now, there are a few. And that's actually the reason why we have these patchwork neighborhoods, because each of these nations that were referred to have the advantages and disadvantages that they offer. And it's actually quite, surprising and I think impressive to some extent that Central Asia managed to participate in security alignments, in economic alignments, in political alignments with very diverse countries, which sometimes do not, do well with each other. And Central Asia, in this particular sense, is an observation, made this structure work. So I would, back to your question about the gravity force, I think depending on the neighborhood, the patchwork neighborhood, the pulling factor or the gravity force would be different depending on what we're talking about. So there would not be one, and that's the advantage of this structure. And the final point about is, while intuitively we understand the desire to stay away from conflicts, isn't that a disadvantage, on missing on global conversations or on missing global advantages? I think it's to the contrary. I think Central Asia has been part of every single conversation that we're having in the international politics. So we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about Eurasian integration, we're talking about the security, both defined by the Chinese, but also security which is defined by the European Union. So this patchwork neighborhood actually allows for Central Asia to diversify. Diversify means to hedge the risks. And that actually is one of the things that, that I think advantages Central Asia to take insights. And I think, that's what I would like to make in this particular presentation. Thank you.